by Kate DiCamillo. Chapter 6. I spent a lot of time that summer at the Herman W. Block Memorial Library. The Herman W. Block Memorial Library sounds like it would be a big fancy place, but it's not. It's just a little old house full of books, and Miss Franny Block is in charge of them all. She is a very small, very old woman with short gray hair, and she was the first friend I made in Naomi. It all started with Winn Dixie not liking it when I went into the library because he couldn't go inside too. But I showed him how he could stand up on his hind legs and look in the window and see me in there selecting my books, and he was okay as long as he could see me. But the thing was, the first time Miss Franny Block saw Winn Dixie standing up on his hind legs like that, looking in the window, she didn't think he was a dog. She thought he was a bear. This is what happened. I was picking out my books and kind of humming to myself, and all of a sudden, there was this loud and scary scream. I went running up to the front of the library, and there was Miss Franny Block sitting on the floor behind her desk. "Miss Franny," I said, "are you all right?" "A bear," she said. "A bear?" I asked. "He has come back," she said. "He has?" I asked. "Where is he?" "Out there," she said, and raised a finger and pointed at Winn Dixie, standing up on his hind legs, looking in the window for me. "Miss Franny Block," I said, "that's not a bear. That's a dog. That's my dog, Winn Dixie." "Are you positive?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," I told her. "I'm positive. He's my dog. I would know him anywhere." Miss Franny sat there trembling and shaking. "Come on," I said. "Let me help you up. It's okay." I stuck out my hand and Miss Franny took hold of it, and I pulled her up off the floor. She didn't weigh hardly anything at all. Once she was standing on her feet, she started acting all embarrassed, saying how I must think she was a silly old lady mistaking a dog for a bear, but that she had a bad experience with a bear coming into the Herman W. Block Memorial Library a long time ago, and she never had quite gotten over it. "When did that happen?" I asked her. "Well," said Miss Franny, "it is a very long story." "That's okay," I told her. "I am like my mama in that I like to be told stories. But before you start telling it, can Winn Dixie come in and listen too? He gets lonely without me." "Well, I don't know," said Miss Franny. "Dogs are not allowed in the Herman W. Block Memorial Library." "He'll be good," I told her. "He's a dog who goes to church." And before she could say yes or no, I went outside and got Winn Dixie. And he came in and laid down with a humph and a sigh, right at Miss Franny's feet. She looked down at him and said, "He most certainly is a large dog." "Yes, ma'am," I told her. "He has a large heart, too." "Well," Miss Franny said. She bent over and gave Winn Dixie a pat on the head, and Winn Dixie wagged his tail back and forth and snuffled his nose on her little old lady feet. "Let me get a chair and sit down so I can tell this story properly." Because of Winn Dixie by Kate DiCamillo. Chapter 7. Back when Florida was wild, when it consisted of nothing but palmetto trees and mosquitoes so big they could fly away with you, Miss Franny Block started in, "and I was just a little girl no bigger than you. My father, Herman W. Block, told me that I could have anything I wanted for my birthday. Anything at all." Miss Franny looked around the library. She leaned in close to me. "I don't want to appear prideful," she said, "but my daddy was a very rich man. A very rich man." She nodded and then leaned back and said, "And I was a little girl who loved to read. So I told him, I said, 'Daddy, I would most certainly love to have a library for my birthday. A small little library would be wonderful.'" "You asked for a whole library?" "A small one," Miss Franny nodded. "I wanted a little house full of nothing but books, and I wanted to share them too. And I got my wish. My father built me this house, the very one we are sitting in now. And at a very young age, I became a librarian. Yes, ma'am. What about the bear? I said. Did I mention that Florida was wild in those days? Miss Franny Block said. Uh-huh, you did. It was wild. There were wild men and wild women and wild animals. Like bears. Yes, ma'am, that's right. Now, I have to tell you, I was a little Miss Know-It-All. I was a Miss Smarty Pants with my library full of books. Oh, yes, ma'am, I thought I knew the answers to everything. Well, one hot Thursday, I was sitting in my library with all the doors and windows open and my nose stuck in a book when a shadow crossed the desk. And without looking up, yes, ma'am, without even looking up, I said, "Is there a book I can help you find?" Well, there was no answer. And I thought it might have been a wild man or a wild woman, scared of all these books and afraid to speak up. But then I became aware of a very peculiar smell, a very strong smell. I raised my eyes slowly, and standing right in front of me was a bear. Yes, ma'am, a very large bear. How big? I asked. Oh, well, said Miss Franny, perhaps 3 times the size of your dog. Then what happened? I asked her. Well, said Miss Franny, I looked at him and he looked at me. He put his big nose up in the air and sniffed, as if he was trying to decide if a little Miss Know-It-All librarian was what he was in the mood to eat. And I sat there. And then I thought, well, if this bear intends to eat me, I am not going to let it happen without a fight. No, ma'am. So very slowly and very carefully, I raised up the book I was reading. What book was that? I asked. Why, it was War and Peace, a very large book. I raised it up slowly, and I aimed it carefully, and I threw it right at that bear and screamed, "Be gone!" And do you know what? No, ma'am, I said. He went. But this is what I will never forget. He took the book with him. Nuh-uh, I said. Yes, ma'am, said Miss Franny. He snatched it up and ran. Did he come back? I asked. No, I never saw him again. Well, the men in town used to tease me about it. They used to say, "Miss Franny, we saw that bear of yours out in the woods today. He was reading that book, and he said it sure was good, and would it be all right if he kept it for just another week?" Yes, ma'am, they did tease me about it. She sighed. I imagine I'm the only one left from those days. I imagine I'm the only one that even recalls that bear. All my friends, everyone I knew when I was young, they are all dead and gone. She sighed again. She looked sad and old and wrinkled. It was the same way I felt sometimes, being friendless in a new town and not having a mama to comfort me. I sighed too. Winn Dixie raised his head off his paws and looked back and forth between me and Miss Franny. He sat up then and showed Miss Franny his teeth. Well, now, look at that, she said. That dog is smiling at me. It's a talent of his, I told her. It is a fine talent, a very fine talent. And she smiled back at Winn Dixie. We could be friends, I said to Miss Franny. I mean, you and me and Winn Dixie, we could all be friends. Miss Franny smiled even bigger. Why, that would be grand, she said, just grand. And right at that minute, right when the 3 of us had decided to be friends, who should come marching in to the Herman W. Block Memorial Library but old pinch-faced Amanda Wilkinson. She walked right up to Miss Franny's desk and said, I finished Johnny Tremaine and I enjoyed it very much. I would like something even more difficult to read now because I am an advanced reader. Yes, dear, I know, said Miss Franny. She got up out of her chair. Amanda pretended like I wasn't there. She stared right past me. Are dogs allowed in the library? She asked Miss Franny as they walked away. Certain ones, said Miss Franny. A select few. And then she turned around and winked at me. I smiled back. I had just made my first friend in Naomi, and nobody was going to mess that up for me, not even old pinch-faced Amanda Wilkinson. Because of Winn-Dixie by Kate DiCamillo. Chapter 8. Winn-Dixie's bald spots started growing fur, and the fur that he had to begin with started looking shiny and healthy, and he didn't limp anymore. And you could tell that he was proud of looking so good, proud of not looking like a stray. I thought what he needed most was a collar and a leash, so I went into Gertrude's Pets, where there were fish and snakes and mice and lizards and gerbils and pet supplies. And I found a real handsome red leather collar with a matching leash. Winn-Dixie was not allowed to come inside the store. There was a big sign on the door that said "No dogs allowed." So I held the collar and the leash up to the window. And Winn-Dixie, who was standing on the other side of the window, pulled up his lip and showed me his teeth and sneezed and wagged his tail something furious. So I knew he absolutely loved that leash and collar combination. But it was very expensive. I decided to explain my situation to the man behind the counter. I said, I don't get a big enough allowance to afford something this fancy, but I love this collar and leash, and so does my dog. And I was thinking that maybe you could set me up on an installment plan. Installment plan? Said the man. Gertrude! Somebody screamed in a real irritating voice. I looked around. It was a parrot. She was sitting on top of one of the fish tanks, looking right at me. An installment plan, I said, ignoring the parrot. You know, where I promise to give you my allowance every week, and you give me the leash and the collar now. I don't think I can do that, said the man. He shook his head. No, the owner, she wouldn't like that. He looked down at the counter. He wouldn't look at me. He had thick black hair, and it was slicked back like Elvis Presley's. He had on a name tag that said Otis. Or I could work for you, I said. I could come in and sweep the floors and dust the shelves and take out the trash. I could do that. I looked around Gertrude's Pets. There was sand and sunflower seed shells and big dust bunnies all over the floor. I could tell that it needed to be swept. Said Otis. He looked down at the counter some more. Gertrude! The parent screamed again. I'm real trustworthy, I said. I'm new in town, but my daddy is a preacher. He's the preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi, so I'm real honest. But the only thing is, Winn-Dixie, my dog, he would have to come inside with me, because if we get separated for too long, he starts to howl something terrible. Gertrude doesn't like dogs, said Otis. Is she the owner? I asked. Yes, no. He finally looked up. He pointed at the fish tank. That Gertrude, the parrot. I named her after the owner. Gertrude's a pretty bird, screamed Gertrude. She might like Winn-Dixie, I told Otis. Almost everybody does. Maybe he could come inside and meet her. And if the two of them get along, then could I have the job? Maybe, Otis mumbled. He looked down at the counter again. So I went and opened the door, and Winn-Dixie came trotting on inside the store. Dog, screamed Gertrude. I know it, Otis told her. And then Gertrude got real quiet. She sat on the top of the fish tank and cocked her head from one side to the other, looking at Winn-Dixie. And Winn-Dixie stood and stared back at her. He didn't hardly move. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't smile. He didn't sneeze. He just stared at Gertrude, and she stared at him. And then she spread her wings out real far and flew and landed on top of Winn-Dixie's head. Dog, she croaked. Winn-Dixie wagged his tail just a little tiny bit. And Otis said, You can start on Monday. Thank you, I told him. You won't be sorry. On the way out of Gertrude's Pets, I said to Winn-Dixie, You are better at making friends than anybody I have ever known. I bet if my mama knew you, she would think you were the best dog ever. Winn-Dixie was smiling up at me, and I was smiling down at him, and so neither one of us was looking where we were going, and we almost bumped right into Sweetie Pie Thomas. She was standing there, sucking on the knuckle of her third finger, staring in the window of Gertrude's Pets. She took her finger out of her mouth and looked at me. Her eyes were all big and round. "Was that bird sitting on that dog's head?" she asked. She had her hair tied up in a ponytail with a pink ribbon. But it wasn't much of a ponytail. It was mostly ribbon and a few strands of hair. "Yes," I told her. "I seen it," she said. She nodded her head and put her knuckle back in her mouth. Then she took it out real quick. "I seen that dog in church, too. He was catching a mouse. I want a dog just like it, but my mama won't let me get no dog. She says if I'm real good, I might get to buy me a goldfish or one of them gerbils. That's what she says. Can I pet your dog?" "Sure," I told her. Sweetie Pie stroked Winn-Dixie's head so long and serious that his eyes drooped half closed and drool came out of the side of his mouth. "I'm going to be 6 years old in September. I gotta stop sucking on my knuckle once I'm 6, said Sweetie Pie. "I'm having a party. Do you want to come to my party? The theme is pink." "Sure," I told her. "Can this dog come?" she asked. "You bet," I told her. And all of a sudden, I felt happy. I had a dog. I had a job. I had Miss Franny Block for a friend. And I had my first invitation to a party in Naomi. It didn't matter that it came from a 5-year-old, and the party wasn't until September. I didn't feel so lonely anymore. Because of Winn-Dixie by Kate DiCamillo. Chapter 9. Just about everything that happened to me that summer happened because of Winn-Dixie. For instance, without him, I would never have met Gloria Dump. He was the one who introduced us. What happened was this. I was riding my bike home from Gertrude's Pets, and Winn-Dixie was running along beside me. We went past Dunlap and Stevie Dewberry's house, and when Dunlap and Stevie saw me, they got on their bikes and started following me. They wouldn't ride with me. They just rode behind me and whispered things that I couldn't hear. Neither one of them had any hair on his head, because their mama shaved their heads every week during the summer because of the one time Dunlap got fleas in his hair from their cat, Sadie. And now they looked like two identical bald-headed babies, even though they weren't twins. Dunlap was 10 years old, like me, and Stevie was 9 and tall for his age. "I can hear you," I hollered back at them. "I can hear what you're saying." But I couldn't. Winn-Dixie started to race way ahead of me. "You better watch out," Dunlap hollered. "That dog is headed right for the witch's house." "Winn-Dixie," I called. But he kept on going faster and hopped a gate and went into the most overgrown jungle of a yard that I had ever seen. "You better go get your dog out of there," Dunlap said. "The witch will eat that dog," Stevie said. "Shut up," I told them. I got off my bike and went up to the gate and hollered, "Winn-Dixie, you better come on out of there." But he didn't. "She's probably eating him right now," Stevie said. He and Dunlap were standing behind me. "She eats dogs all the time." "Get lost, you bald-headed babies," I said. "Hey," said Dunlap, "that ain't a very nice way for a preacher's daughter to talk." He and Stevie backed up a little. I stood there and thought for a minute. I finally decided that I was more afraid of losing Winn-Dixie than I was of having to deal with a dog-eating witch, so I went through the gate and into the yard. "That witch is going to eat the dog for dinner and you for dessert," Stevie said. "We'll tell the preacher what happened to you," Dunlap shouted after me. By then, I was deep in the jungle. There was every kind of thing growing everywhere. There were flowers and vegetables and trees and vines. "Winn-Dixie," I said. I heard, "This dog sure likes to eat." I went around a really big tree all covered in moss, and there was Winn-Dixie. He was eating something right out of the witch's hand. She looked up at me. "This dog sure likes peanut butter," she said. "You can always trust a dog that likes peanut butter." She was old, with crinkly brown skin. She had on a big floppy hat with flowers all over it. And she didn't have any teeth. But she didn't look like a witch. She looked nice. And Winn Dixie liked her, I could tell. "I'm sorry he got in your garden," I said. "You ain't gotta be sorry," she said. "I enjoy a little company." "My name's Opal," I told her. "My name's Gloria Dump," she said. "Ain't that a terrible last name, Dump?" "My last name is Baloney," I said. "Sometimes the kids at school back home in Watley called me lunch meat." "Ha!" Gloria Dump laughed. "What about this dog? What you call him?" "Winn Dixie," I said. Winn Dixie thumped his tail on the ground. He tried smiling, but it was hard with his mouth all full of peanut butter. "Winn Dixie?" Gloria Dump said. "You mean like the grocery store?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. "Ooh-wee," she said. "That takes the strange name prize, don't it?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. "I was just fixin' to make myself a peanut butter sandwich," she said. "You want one too?" "All right," I said. "Yes, please." "Go on and sit down," she said, pointing at a lawn chair with the back all busted out of it. "But sit down careful." I sat down careful, and Gloria Dump made me a peanut butter sandwich on white bread. Then she made one for herself and put her false teeth in to eat it. When she was done, she said to me, "You know, my eyes ain't too good at all. I can't see nothing but the general shape of things. So I got to rely on my heart. Why don't you go on and tell me everything about yourself, so as I can see you with my heart?" And because Winn Dixie was looking up at her like she was the best thing he had ever seen, and because the peanut butter sandwich had been so good, and because I had been waiting for a long time to tell some person everything about me, I did. Because of Winn Dixie by Kate DiCamillo. Chapter 10. I told Gloria Dump everything. I told her how me and the preacher had just moved to Naomi and how I had to leave all my friends behind. I told her about my mama leaving, and I listed out the 10 things that I knew about her. And I explained that here in Naomi, I missed Mama more than I ever had in Watley. I told her about the preacher being like a turtle, hiding all the time inside his shell. I told her about finding Winn Dixie in the produce department and how, because of him, I became friends with Miss Franny Block and got a job working for a man named Otis at Gertrude's Pets and got invited to Sweetie Pie Thomas's birthday party. I even told Gloria Dump how Dunlap and Stevie Dewberry called her a witch. But I told her they were stupid, mean, bald-headed boys, and I didn't believe them. Not for long, anyhow. And the whole time I was talking, Gloria Dump was listening. She was nodding her head and smiling and frowning and saying, and "Is that right?" I could feel her listening with all her heart, and it felt good. "You know what?" she said when I was all done. "What?" "Could be that you got more of your mama in you than just red hair and freckles and running fast." "Really?" I said. "Like what?" "Like maybe you got her green thumb. The two of us could plant something and see how it grows. Test your thumb out." "Okay," I said. What Gloria Dump picked for me to grow was a tree. Or she said it was a tree. To me, it looked more like a plant. She had me dig a hole for it and put it in the ground and pat the dirt around it tight, like it was a baby and I was tucking it into bed. "What kind of tree is it?" I asked Gloria Dump. "It's a wait-and-see tree," she said. "What's that mean?" "It means you got to wait for it to grow up before you know what it is." "Can I come back and see it tomorrow?" I asked. "Child," she said, "as long as this is my garden, you're welcome in it. But that tree ain't going to have changed much by tomorrow." "But I want to see you too," I said. "Humph," said Gloria Dump. "I ain't going nowhere. I be right here." I woke Winn-Dixie up then. He had peanut butter in his whiskers, and he kept yawning and stretching. He licked Gloria Dump's hand before we left, and I thanked her. That night, when the preacher was tucking me into bed, I told him how I got a job at Gertrude's Pets, and I told him all about making friends with Miss Franny Block and getting invited to Sweetie Pie's party, and I told him about meeting Gloria Dump. Winn-Dixie lay on the floor, waiting for the preacher to leave so he could hop up on the bed like he always did. When I was done talking, the preacher kissed me goodnight, and then he leaned way over and gave Winn-Dixie a kiss too, right on top of his head. "You can go ahead and get up there now," he said to Winn-Dixie. Winn-Dixie looked at the preacher. He didn't smile at him, but he opened his mouth wide like he was laughing, like the preacher had just told him the funniest joke in the world. And this is what amazed me the most. The preacher laughed back. Winn-Dixie hopped up on the bed, and the preacher got up and turned out the light. I leaned over and kissed Winn-Dixie too, right on the nose, but he didn't notice. He was already asleep and snoring. Because of Winn-Dixie by Kate D. Camillo. Chapter 11. That night, there was a real bad thunderstorm. But what woke me up wasn't the thunder and lightning. It was Winn-Dixie, whining and butting his head against my bedroom door. "Winn-Dixie," I said, "what are you doing?" He didn't pay any attention to me. He just kept beating his head against the door and whining and whimpering. And when I got out of bed and went over and put my hand on his head, he was shaking and trembling so hard that it scared me. I knelt down and wrapped my arms around him, but he didn't turn and look at me or smile or sneeze or wag his tail or do any normal kind of Winn-Dixie thing. He just kept beating his head against the door and crying and shaking. "You want that door open?" I said. "Huh? Is that what you want?" I stood up and opened the door, and Winn-Dixie flew through it like something big and ugly and mean was chasing him. "Winn-Dixie," I hissed, "come back here." I didn't want him going and waking the preacher up. But it was too late. Winn-Dixie was already at the other end of the trailer, in the preacher's room. I could tell because there was a sproing sound that must have come from Winn-Dixie jumping up on the bed. And then there was a sound from the preacher, like he was real surprised. But none of it lasted long, because Winn-Dixie came tearing back out of the preacher's room, panting and running like crazy. I tried to grab him, but he was going too fast. "Opal?" said the preacher. He was standing at the door to his bedroom, and his hair was all kind of wild on top of his head, and he was looking around like he wasn't sure where he was. "Opal, what's going on?" "I don't know," I told him. But just then, there was a huge crack of thunder, one so loud that it shook the whole trailer. And Winn-Dixie came shooting back out of my room and went running right past me, and I screamed, "Daddy, watch out!" But the preacher was still confused. He just stood there. And Winn-Dixie came barreling right toward him like he was a bowling ball, and the preacher was the only pin left standing. And wham! They both fell to the ground. "Uh-oh," I said. "Opal?" said the preacher. He was lying on his stomach, and Winn-Dixie was sitting on top of him, panting and whining. "Yes, sir," I said. "Opal?" the preacher said again. "Yes, sir," I said louder. "Do you know what a pathological fear is?" "No, sir," I told him. The preacher raised a hand. He rubbed his nose. "Well," he said after a minute, "it's a fear that goes way beyond normal fears. It's a fear you can't be talked out of or reasoned out of." Just then, there was another crack of thunder, and Winn-Dixie rose straight up in the air like somebody had poked him with something hot. When he hit the floor, he started running. He ran back to my bedroom, and I didn't even try to catch him. I just got out of his way. The preacher lay there on the ground, rubbing his nose. Finally, he sat up. He said, "Opal, I believe Winn-Dixie has a pathological fear of thunderstorms." And just when he finished his sentence, here came Winn-Dixie again, running to save his life. I got the preacher up off the floor and out of the way just in time. There didn't seem to be a thing we could do for Winn-Dixie to make him feel better, so we just sat there and watched him run back and forth, all terrorized and panting. And every time there was another crack of thunder, Winn-Dixie acted all over again like it was surely the end of the world. The storm won't last long, the preacher told me, and when it's over, the real Winn-Dixie will come back. After a while, the storm did end. The rain stopped, and there wasn't any more lightning, and finally, the last rumble of thunder went away. And Winn-Dixie quit running back and forth and came over to where me and the preacher were sitting and cocked his head, like he was saying, "What in the world are you two doing out of bed in the middle of the night?" And then he crept up on the couch with us in this funny way he has, where he gets on the couch an inch at a time, kind of sliding himself onto it, looking off in a different direction, like it's all happening by accident. Like he doesn't intend to get on the couch, but all of a sudden, there he is. And so the three of us sat there. I rubbed Winn-Dixie's head and scratched him behind the ears the way he liked. And the preacher said, "There are an awful lot of thunderstorms in Florida in the summertime." "Yes, sir," I said. I was afraid that maybe he would say we couldn't keep a dog who went crazy with pathological fear every time there was a crack of thunder. "We'll have to keep an eye on him," the preacher said. He put his arm around Winn-Dixie. "We'll have to make sure he doesn't get out during a storm. He might run away. We have to make sure we keep him safe." "Yes, sir," I said again. All of a sudden, it was hard for me to talk. I loved the preacher so much. I loved him because he loved Winn-Dixie. I loved him because he was going to forgive Winn-Dixie for being afraid. But most of all, I loved him for putting his arm around Winn-Dixie like that, like he was already trying to keep him safe. Because of